Oh God, you are here, and we are here. Now, Lord, may we be conscious of your presence, and may we be here together. And may the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Oh, these beautiful people. Good morning. So in reflecting on today's gospel lesson that we just read about the weed and the weeds, I was reminded of a dear, sweet friend, Charlie Sturm. He was a priest, and this cross was Charlie's. I've talked about him before, but Charlie was one of my kindred spirits, and we were really close, and he often prayed a prayer, and it was attributed to Reinhold Niebuhr, who is considered by some, or at least by many, one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century. And the prayer we know it as the Serenity Prayer. And it's at the heart and at the ethos of Alcoholics Anonymous. And perhaps you're familiar with it. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. You familiar with that prayer? I got an amen. Woo! This is the first part of the prayer, actually. There's more to it. There's a second part that we're often less familiar with. So it goes like this. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting the hardships as a pathway to peace, taking as he did the sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that he will make all things right if I surrender to his will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever and ever in the next. See, sometimes when those things don't go as planned or as expected or as desired, we wrestle with accepting things as they are and not as we would like them to be. We attempt to control, to manage, to manipulate, and fix the situation, don't we? Even when we say, I'm not controlling, yes, we are, right? We attempt to fix things. And it ends up robbing us often when things don't go like we want or like we think they should be. Charlie also used to preach, don't should on me. Because, right? And because there's a lot of shoulds and oughts in our minds. And when things don't go as they should or as they ought, and we want to control and fix and manipulate and all of that, it ends up robbing us of our peace and our joy. And it leaves us stressed out and often very anxious trying to make sense of it all. And this prayer, I think, is an antidote to this mindset. And it captures the heart of today's reading that I think is an extremely challenging reading in this parable. Jesus tells a parable of a farmer planting seeds, right? But while everyone is sleeping, it always seems like the enemy does the enemy's greatest work while we're unconscious, right? Right? And I think there's an invitation to wakefulness in this. But while they were sleeping, the enemy comes along and plants the weeds. He discovers weeds growing with the wheat the next morning. So the slave asked the farmer, Master, if you sowed good seeds in the field, then where then did these weeds come from? God, if you're good, if you're really good, then where did these weeds come from in my life? I think we've all wondered that, haven't we? Where then did these weeds come from? I mean, when we're touched by the challenges of life, hurts or wounds or betrayals or whatever, when faced with suffering, an illness, a loss of a loved one, when confronted with nasty, emotionally ugly, and unpleasant people. You ever been around one of those people before? Or simply people who don't think or vote or believe like they should, like us, right? We wonder, where did these weeds come from? Lord, where did these weeds come from? And if you always notice, at least I notice, I'm never the weed, right? I'm the wheat. I'm never the weed. See, when we discover weeds in our field, we attempt, or we expect, or we want an explanation. And someone we can blame, someone we can hold accountable, someone we can even punish, right? Someone that we can point to that broke it and how we're going to fix it, right? I mean, in our aversion, sometimes we can destructively react in words or in actions to rid ourselves of those weeds. Now, I think part of this parable, part of the reason it's in the Gospel of Matthew, was because it was for the early church. And 2,000 years later, we have 41,000 denominations worldwide. And they didn't read this gospel, right? They just added it a couple years ago. It hasn't been there for the last 1,500 years since the canons were established. I'm kidding. It's been there all along. And Jesus told this parable and this story. But 41,000 denominations, the church. We have a weed eater in one hand and some Roundup weed killer in another. And we've gone out, we've been guilty of attempting to rid ourselves of perceived weeds for 2,000 years. Right? It's the truth. The truth is, though, and here's the kicker, within each of us lies the potential for good or bad. That's just the way that it is. The capacity for both good and for harm. We're both weed and wheat, or we both have weed and wheat growing inside us. That's a reality. And it takes a lot more patience and compassion and forgiveness and love to tend to the garden of our souls than aiming for some ideal of perfection, which often just usually blinds us to our own faults. To avoid cynicism and negativity, we must acknowledge and accept and forgive this mixed bag of reality that we are. And that is such a gift to us. See, no longer do I have to pretend before myself, before you, or before God that I got a little weed and a little wheat all growing right there. See, I can just name it. Oh God, there it is. I acknowledge and I accept it. And I let God tend to the garden, right? Strangely, when we look at this parable for the day, Jesus doesn't seem nearly as troubled by the weeds as we often are. Y'all ever notice that? That Jesus doesn't seem to be troubled by all these weeds. Not nearly as much as we are. They came up to Jesus and said, why then, where did these weeds come from? As he tells the story, the farmer, right? And his simply explanation is this: an enemy has done this. In other words, this wasn't God, for us in our context. This wasn't God. Things happen in life. Life hurts. God doesn't instigate evil. God doesn't cause harm to what God loves. An enemy did this. He offers no explanation, but just a simple awareness to what is. No blame, no fault finding. It's just a simple, God, grant me the serenity to accept things that I cannot change. The courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. See, the slaves in the story take a reactive posture, don't they? And they say, do you want us to get rid of the weeds? But here's the thing. If you know what this story is and this weed in this story, it is darnel, and it looks more like wheat, especially when it's young in its infancy. You can't tell the difference between the wheat and the weed. It's difficult to distinguish the difference. And what happens is they start to intertwine and grow together. And so by reacting and attempting to rid the weeds, we damage the life of the wheat. Y'all ever seen that before? Like in your life somewhere? You know, I've seen dioceses, entire dioceses, actually try to rid itself of weeds. Thousands of people with hundreds of years of history. Some people came along and decided that they were going to rid the church of weeds. And in doing so, ripped up a whole lot of beautiful, life-giving wheat in the process. Jesus says this, let them grow together until the harvest. Voila. How simple. Then you can discern what is wheat and what is weed. See, I think Jesus is trying to encourage his followers, and Matthew, who recorded this in this gospel, is trying to encourage the early church not to jump to premature conclusions and judgments by the appearance of things, but to hold it in tension. And that's what troubles us. That I might think you're a weed, and I can't stand that. So I have to hold that in tension, and I would just much rather rid myself of you. And therefore, I can be at peace. But Jesus invites us to something that's beyond us, something more than we think that we are. Jesus invites us to trust God by accepting the world as it is, not as we should have it. See, because sometimes we see weeds, and Jesus may see the wheat. How do we know? I told you this was a challenging text, didn't I? And see, that's the gift in this for us. The truth is, like Isaiah in our passage this morning says, I'm going to paraphrase it for you, there is a God, and I'm not it. And that gives me a lot of freedom. I don't have to be. I can trust God to be God. God doesn't need me to be God. As a matter of fact, I can't be, nor am I supposed to be. And there's freedom from that. I can let go and let God be God. See, the words translated, let them grow, in Jesus' statement, let them grow together, are the same words that Jesus spoke from the cross. And when you look at the Greek and the root words, they're the same words he spoke from the cross. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. Even from the cross, it seems that Jesus is unwilling to criticize, judge, condemn, or rip up weeds. And that's significant for us. And it's good news. Because here's the deal. When I can admit, when I can acknowledge, when I can address the truth that I've got a little weed in there as well as some wheat, that God can tend to that. I don't have to judge. I don't have to criticize myself. I don't have to condemn myself. I don't have to get rid of the weeds. But when I can come to that place within myself, guess what happens? I can look at you in your fullness of your humanity and see you just like I am, with a little weed and a little wheat. See why this is so challenging? See, but that's the gift. Don't pull up the weeds. We're invited to trust God in the same manner that Jesus himself trusts God. Now, please do not hear what I'm not saying. To accept the weeds doesn't mean that you say evil is okay. but it's to look beyond our reactive nature of our thoughts and emotions and to be responsive like Jesus, which is always compassionate. See, when I'm in a reacting mode, right? When I'm just reflex and I'm reacting, the next thing you know, I end up doing some damage. But when I'm being responsive, there's a difference. I'm tending to myself or to you or to what's in front of me. And I can invite God into that place and perhaps allow for love and forgiveness to take place. Allow love and forgiveness and to work against evil, but not by working against, by trying to eradicate the weeds. And see, I can do that for myself. I can do that in the community, and we can do that in the world. To accept the weeds doesn't say evil's okay or to lay down, but to be responsive like Jesus, which is always compassionate. For who knows, maybe what we perceive as weed is actually wheat. It just needs to be tended to some, right? And we see, when we turn and we are focused on the Redeemer who came to make all things new, we can take heart and live with hope in this day, one day at a time, in the present, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships as a pathway to peace, taking, as he did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it. And see, in the end, it'll be up to God, not me or you or us, to sort out the weed and the weeds and the wheat. As the prayer says, that we can trust that he will make all things right. And for that, we can say thanks be to God. Amen.